Hi there, welcome to Unit 2 in Animal Nutrition. This section will cover how we evaluate feedstuffs for farm livestock. So we're going to talk a good deal about testing, nutrient fractions, how we determine what those are, the most accurate methods of testing, and so forth. So let's get to our content here. I'll let you go over the objectives here, but again, suffice it to say that we're going to talk just briefly about sampling methods, how we understand feedstuff digestibility, and how we do some just physical and visual appraisal of feeds. First things first, let's talk about analytical methods for nutrient composition. There's essentially three ways that we can go about determining nutrient need, and we'll hit into these a little bit more detail as we go here. The first one is simple chemical procedures, where the feed analyses will go through a number of different titrations. If we're doing a wet chemistry analysis, we could go in vitro, which means testing, of course, in a petri dish. We could actually mix in some colorimetry, where we're using an NIR machine, and I'll cover what that is here later on in the lecture. Even in vivo methods, where we do some sampling within an animal. We have some methodology to do that. These are the most common actual testing methods for determining how much, the levels of nutrient in different feedstuffs. We can also do some microbiological methods, where we isolate some bacteria, feed them different feedstuffs on a substrate, and then determine the amount of nutrient disappearance. These are used only in very specific situations because it is somewhat expensive and also lacks some practicality at times. And then finally, there is biological testing methods, where we essentially just straight test it on a live animal, and we'll hit on that one a little bit as well. So we essentially measure a feed it to the animal, measure what comes out, and figure out what disappears in the middle. And this is actually the most accurate way to determine feed digestibility and feed nutrient content. It's just quite slow and expensive, as you can imagine. So let's get into some more detail here. Somewhat of a busy slide here, but let's talk briefly about sampling feeds for analysis. And I'll pause for a second and really stress this, because it's essential to have a proper sampling technique in order to make sure that we have reliable feed nutrient evaluation, because a bad sample is going to result in bad results. So first things first is we're going to take a representative sample. That might be a number of different things, and I'll get to some different examples here in a second. But whatever that feed is, we want to have a good representative sample of the feed stuff. Not concentrated in one area, not concentrated in one bale, not concentrated in one spot in the bunker or bag. So next, then, you're going to clearly identify the feed. If we're talking about corn silage, you might identify it simply as corn silage. If there's multiple silos or multiple bunkers, you might identify it by bunker. If you know the cutting of hay, you might identify it in that manner. You certainly might identify it grass hay versus alfalfa hay. There's a number of different identification methods that you can go through. It just really depends on who you're working with in terms of the producer, your lab, and how you might want the sample reported. So once we identify it, then let's talk about grains and mixed feeds, prepared feeds that come out of the feed mill first of all. For quality control reasons, feed mills test regularly on their own. So a nutritionist isn't often going to be called upon to go out and test a grain or mixed feed or a bagged feed. If you did, though, you would want to take 2 to 3 samples per bag from about 5 to 7 bags. Consequently, the United States Department of Agriculture, as part of their quality control oversight responsibility, does do this on a regular basis. And so you might catch them at one of your feed stores making a small incision into a bag, passing a probe in there, and grabbing some samples out. And then they'll patch that hole and it'll say USDA checked or something like that. But essentially, you want 2 to 3 samples per bag, 5 to 7 bags. So again, we're talking about 12 to 15 samples. Same thing if we're talking about a bulk feed that's been dumped in a feed bin or in a commodity bay. 12 to 15 different grab samples from different locations. You can grab yourself a good old-fashioned Prairie Farms ice cream bucket, dump them all in there, mix them up, and then take a good representative grab or 1 to 2 pound sample from that, put it in a good old Ziploc baggie, and send it off to the laboratory, and you should get a pretty sound analysis. If we look at sampling hay, then you utilize what we call a core sampler. Some of those are cordless drill driven. Some of them are just push probes. Some of them are hand crank, whatever you like. But basically, 1 sample per bale and going across the grain of the bale so that the stem doesn't wind up in the kind of bind up into the sampler. And you want to take several bales. You don't need all of them in a pile, but a good representative pile. You don't want to skew it by just doing 1 bale or 1 bale on either end. So you want to try and get a good representative sample of the number of bales that you would like to select from. Again, dump that in a Ziploc baggie, and then send it off to the laboratory. If we're talking about silages, so corn silage, wheat silage, anything wet feed, you want to take grab samples during feed out or scrape across the face in a number of different spots in terms of a bunker silo. And again, put those in your trusty ice cream bucket, mix them all up, and then grab 1 representative sample out there, put it into your sampling baggie, and then prepare it for shipping to the laboratory. It's important when we're talking about mixed wet feeds like silages to freeze or refrigerate them. If you can't get them right away off to the laboratory, remember they are ensiled feeds. They will go through perspiration. They will start to decompose in the bag, and so you'll see condensation inside the bag if you throw it in the dashboard of the pickup truck or something like that. So in order to maintain quality, if you're not going to be able to send it for a couple days, put it in the freezer or refrigerator to maintain its quality. I have a spot over here on the side that harvest sampling is not really recommended. Now you can do it. We'll give you an initial reading in terms of what your corn silage might be in terms of value, but because those feeds are not fermented totally, it will tend to be inaccurate and therefore cause you some false sense of security in terms of what's there. Now, if we're talking about sampling corn grain as it comes out of the field, that's probably not going to matter all that much. But generally speaking, we don't recommend harvest sampling or taking samples as it comes out of the field. Of course, benefits of sampling, first things first, if you're not going to use the data, it's not worth it. We're not talking about major cost here, $15 to $35 or $40 per sample, but of course that adds up. So make sure that you're going to use the data. But what are the benefits of sampling as we think about it? First and foremost, saving money in the long run. We want to be able to minimize unnecessary feed supplementation, especially those things that are expensive in the ration. We don't want to feed any more than we have to. Feed sampling and nutrient analysis will tell us where the deficiencies are that we can address. Second, we can properly balance the ration so that we don't under or overfeed nutrients. Again, those things get quite expensive, and so we want to make sure that we can properly have the right amount of information and the proper data to properly balance a ration. Third, then we can examine different things. We can determine sometimes what things might be limiting production or performance. We can discover problems that might be existent within a feed and how we might address those things, as we've mentioned here before. So those are the 3 main benefits to sampling, and I highly recommend it for commercial production. It's well worth the money. This is a very busy slide, and this would be the wet chemistry analysis that I recommended before, and we'll kind of wrap up our first segment with this particular slide. So essentially, I want to try and call your attention to the middle of the slide, and we'll talk about proximate feed analysis. Again, we're talking about wet chemistry here. So wet chemistry is going to tell us a number of different things. And if I slide my pointer over here, we'll highlight dry matter first. And I just asked really quickly, how do we test and what is the benefit of dry matter? Simply, we're going to just dry it and remove the water. And that removes the variability when we talk about the feed, and we'll then add dry matter as part of the report. Second, moving across the slide, we're going to essentially take a piece of that sample and just simply burn it. That creates what we call ash, And that is how we then take a step further and figure out the mineral content that might be present in that particular feed. And we'll send that through a number of different processes, but I'll basically kind of leave it right there for now. Next is we'll want to determine then, of course, crude protein. Crude protein is digested through the Kjeldahl process, and that's all you need to know for the purposes of our class. It's a procedure that they put a piece of that feed sample through. It digests off the nitrogen that is in the feed, and then we can measure the amount of nitrogen that's there, and again multiply that times 6.25, and we have the percent crude protein that will be added to your report. Moving again across the slide on a clockwise fashion, we can measure what we call ether extract. And here's where we're testing the fat content. And they'll essentially, again, take a piece of that sample that you've sent in, send it through a different procedure, and we measure then the difference in weight as we digest off the different other components of carbohydrates and other fractions that are there. And what will be left is the fat content, again, expressed in a percentage. Go to the bottom left-hand quadrant of the slide, and we'll measure carbohydrates. And so we're going to measure both nitrogen-free extract and crude fiber. We'll hit both of those things. Crude fiber is the cellulose and lignin component, and nitrogen-free extract is the sugar and starches component. Two different pieces of the carbohydrate picture that we want to figure out in a different manner. Over here on the right is the Van Soest method, which is also related to energy in some regards, and we'll talk about that here in a second. But essentially, we're going to figure out the amount of carbohydrate, again, by putting a sample in a glass jar and just burning it. And the amount of heat that it generates is called calories, of course, and that's the amount of heat that is required to raise 1 gram of water 1 degree C. And so all of these are going to be expressed in some caloric density number. Again, moving across the slide here, approximate feed analysis or a wet chemistry test is going to tell you vitamin content. Some of these are routine, like a hay analysis and a wet chemistry test is going to give you generally speaking, going to give you a vitamin A and vitamin D and vitamin E report. If there are more things that you want, some of those are special order. Then the Van Soest method is your fiber analysis, and there's a number of different things steps that we go through to do the Van Soest method, but essentially what we're coming down to is ADF and NDF fractions. ADF is acid detergent fiber, and essentially indicates the quality and the digestibility of the fiber that is present in that feedstuff. NDF is neutral detergent fiber and indicates the physical fill factor that might be in a feedstuff. So the higher the NDF fraction, the less digestible the feedstuff is. Like straw would have a very high NDF fraction. Again, these are very accurate and can be somewhat expensive with these wet chemistry methods. All right, we're going to take a time out there. We're about 13 minutes in. We'll give you a chance to pause and reflect upon this section. We'll catch you for section 2.